The SEGA Saturn just couldn't do transparency. Not at all. Not even a little. Here's how the SEGA Saturn can do transparency. Part 1. Why the Saturn couldn't do transparency. You see, when SEGA was putting the Saturn together, they ran into a bit of a roadblock with the GPU. Nobody at SEGA past Yu Suzuki and the Virtua team knew how to do things in 3D, so when designing the Saturn, they went with an approach they hoped would be good. And it was just okay. The system's approach was basically distorting sprites into polygons, which is probably why the way they went about doing texture mapping was wrong. You see, the way textures are mapped is split in two big ways: forward and inverse. Inverse is what basically everyone uses, forward is what SEGA used. To explain the difference, imagine the following. We have our screen, or basically frame buffer. We also have a texture. The frame buffer is made out of pixels. The texture is made out of texels. Texels are just pixels on a texture. I assume they happened because when John Graphics was explaining texture mapping to people, he just had to come up with an easy way to distinguish them. Anyways, when you normally draw a texture to the screen, here's how it works. So you have your, let's just take a quad, right, and the GPU will just iterate through each pixel on the screen and check which texture coordinate it corresponds to. Basically, every time you draw a pixel, you look back at the texture to see which pixel you're supposed to be drawing, and then you draw that pixel, and that's inverse texture mapping. The way SEGA did it was just by going through each pixel on a texture and painting those pixels on the screen, aka full texture mapping. This approach has a few big issues. First of all, it wastes a ton of pixels while redrawing. Secondly, it breaks transparency because when you redraw a pixel multiple times, well, you're gonna break transparency because you're basically drawing multiple slates of glass over something. It's gonna change the color. Thirdly, with the way they did it, every quad was a texture, which you then drew directly to the screen, meaning you had no actual texture coordinates. So UV mapping, the basic thing you do in texturing and modeling, was basically impossible, therefore making 3D models was harder. Fourthly, because smaller polygons redrew less pixels, sometimes it was just better to use more small polygons than just a few big ones. Of course, as you probably know, the Saturn had two GPUs, so let's look at what the second GPU was used for, because all of the methods that developers used both GPUs. The VDP2 did a few things. It could display 4 backgrounds that were kind of static 2D. The first 2 backgrounds had a few more fancy features, the second ones had a few less fancy features, and you also had 2 3D backgrounds which could do some fancy stuff. VDP 1 and 2 had 512 kilobytes of RAM each, but VDP 1 was also connected to a 512 kilobyte frame buffer. More on this later. The way the graphic pipeline works is that VDP1 first draws stuff to the frame buffer, then sends it to VDP2, which will then merge it with the other layers and output it to the RGB encoder DAC and then out to your TV. So now that we know how that works, part 2, how the Saturn could do transparency. So you know how like the Saturn could do the fake transparency with how you had those little checkerboard things? We're not talking about that. Here's how it could do real transparency. Sonic R did it by doing some trickery. You see, the Saturn has these color calculation ratio bits for sprites. You could use them to have several layers of transparency between VDP1 sprites and VDP2. This is pretty cool, right? Well, thankfully this method actually has a video on it by GameHut, and the game's own developer talks about it. He basically ran into a small, huge problem. You see, when you add shading to it, the polygon itself will fade, but the lighting will stay there. So he just decided to add more lighting data to the vertices so the game can fade the lighting properly for 25, 50, 75, and 100% shading. The final outcome ended up using all 8 mix ratios, and then the 4 lighting ratios for a total of 12 fade-in layers. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, granted, it's not gonna help us when we have transparency from object to object, but it's going to let us actually fade objects that are far in the distance, so we can have some kind of view fog that doesn't look ugly. Though, of course, this also provides us with the idea that we can just use one ratio on the lighting, and though that can definitely make it look a little bit uglier, it will also save some storage for the lighting levels, but it can get better. Here's Panzer Dragoon Saga. How do they do this? Well, it's actually kind of simple. More games use this. This is just one example. So all they do is design everything with how it would look when the water would be there, and then they added water as a transparent layer in VDP2 as one of the 3D planes, and it looks great! This is the power of good art direction and some trickery. But both of these effects were basically just relying on some VDP2 trickery. Well, okay, the last one will use both VDP1 and VDP2 trickery. Here's Burning Ranges. You see how it has real transparency, not just on the definitely 3D particle effects, but also on some of the objects? Well, here's how they did it. So I mentioned the Saturn has a 512 kilobyte frame buffer, but that's actually a lie. It has two 256 kilobyte frame buffers, and you use both of them because that's how double buffering works. Now, consider that most games ran at like 320 by 240 at 16 bits per pixel. That gave us about 154 kilobytes per frame buffer, and that's a lot of empty space, isn't it? So we could actually fit a 480 by 240 screen into the frame buffer, which is, you know, ultra wide and 50% wider than the normal one. Because 320 by 240 divided by 2 is 160 by 120, which is exactly the amount of space we have basically, we can neatly fit a second frame buffer into the frame buffer. We can then divide all the coordinates of the transparent polygons by 2, and then offset them horizontally to the right by 220 pixels, though I'm unsure if this is what they did. Then when we're ready to send the entire frame from VDP1 to VDP2, we first set up a DMA transfer to send the transparency frame buffer to a VDP2 layer that could do bitmap mode. Then we just tell it to zoom in by 2 times so it perfectly fits the screen. Then all it's left to do is to just lower the opacity of the transparency frame buffer in order for the objects to be transparent, and then you just actually send out the VDP1 frame buffer, merge them, send them out, and there you go. Now, of course, you may be wondering, is this slower than doing it normally? No, it actually has the potential to be faster. Well, look, you need to spend some CPU time to arrange the commands and DMA, spend some VDP2 time to set up the layer, though that is not really that relevant, and you need to spend some VDP1 raster time. And by doing that, we don't have to do that half checkerboard transparency that the games do. You see, the biggest reason why this is faster is because of the Saturn's not so great fill rate, and a lot of that fill rate is just wasted on redrawing pixels. And because we're drawing so many less pixels, remember we have a quarter of the screen, there's just way less overdraw, which saves just a lot of drawing time compared to the other method. Of course, the transparent things we render are at a lower resolution, which means that it's fine for particles or glass or that sort of stuff, just not for the super fine details. There were, of course, other ways of getting the Saturn to do some form of transparency, I'm pretty sure, but these are the 3 main ones that I've come across. I hope this was as interesting to you as it was to me, and I also hope I dumbed down the technical stuff to a level that's just easy to understand. Thanks for watching, bye.